Hey everyone, welcome back. You ever notice how some people just seem to roll with the punches better than others? Like, even when life throws them a real curveball, they somehow manage to come out stronger on the other side?
Oh, yeah, for sure. We're talking about resilience here, that ability to bounce back from tough times, especially for kids. Growing up can be a wild ride.
It really can be. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. How does resilience actually work, especially when kids have gone through some pretty rough stuff early on? We've got a lot of ground to cover today. I've been digging into some fascinating research on kids who've experienced things like maltreatment and how they manage to not just survive, but actually thrive. Plus, we'll look at how early intervention programs can step in and make a real difference. And to top it off, we've got some super practical tips and strategies that any parent or caregiver can use to help build that resilience muscle in the young people in their lives.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
We do, but that's what we're here for, right? To break down complex topics and figure out what it all means for us in the real world. So let's start with the million-dollar question. What is resilience, really? How do we even define something that can look so different from person to person?
Well, I think the American Psychological Association, or APA, has a pretty good starting point. They say resilience is all about adapting well when you face adversity.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's not just some personality trait you're born with, right? Like some people are just naturally resilient and others aren't.
Not necessarily. It's more of a process, actually. It's about
Okay.
learning how to think, behave, and react when things get tough.
So it's like a skill you can develop over time.
That's the idea. And, it's interesting. Researchers haven't always agreed on one single definition. Even measuring resilience can be a real head-scratcher.
I bet. It must be like trying to measure happiness or something. It's so subjective.
It really is. Early on, researchers were really focused on specific traits, like, is there a magic ingredient that makes some kids more resilient? But now, there's a bigger emphasis on context. What helps one kid bounce back might not work for another.
Because everyone's different and their experiences are different too.
Right. It's all about the individual and their unique circumstances.
Hmm.
Their family, their community, their cultural background. It all plays a part.
So we've got to zoom out and look at the whole picture, not just the child in isolation. Now, our sources really dive into some heavy stuff, like the long-term impact of child maltreatment. That's got to leave some deep scars, right?
It can. The research is pretty clear on that. Child maltreatment can seriously mess with a child's psychosocial functioning,
Meaning,
meaning their ability to form healthy relationships, regulate their emotions, and just generally navigate the social world. And on a societal level, the financial burden is huge. One estimate puts the lifetime cost per victim at over $210,000.
wow, that's a powerful argument for prevention, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And there are promising prevention strategies out there, things like the Nurse-Family Partnership and the Positive Parenting Program, or Triple P. But one thing that really jumped out at me from our sources is that maltreated children aren't doomed. They're not destined for a life of hardship.
That's really important to emphasize. There's hope.
Exactly. Many of these kids show incredible resilience and find ways to overcome these terrible experiences.
And I know our sources talk about protective factors, right? Things like intelligence, temperament, a loving family member, a good school, positive peer relationships. It sounds like those can really make a difference in whether a child develops resilience.
Oh, they're crucial. Think of them like buffers. They shield kids from the full impact of adversity. We can't go into each one in detail today, but the point is, resilience isn't just about what you go through. It's also about the good stuff, the support you have around you.
So nature and nurture working together. Now, I want to talk about this review of longitudinal studies you shared. These are studies that track people over many years. Why are those so important for understanding something like resilience?
Well, because resilience isn't a one-time thing. It plays out over a lifetime. Longitudinal studies let us watch how it develops, how it changes as kids grow up, and if it actually sticks around for the long haul. And what's really interesting, and maybe a little disheartening, is that these studies are finding that resilience isn't always stable, especially for kids who've been maltreated.
So just because a kid shows resilience at one point doesn't mean they'll always be resilient.
Exactly. The research suggests that resilience at one stage doesn't guarantee resilience at another. And in fact, the rates of sustained resilience over time for these kids are pretty low, according to the review.
Wow. Can you give us some concrete examples from the studies?
Sure. Take the Minnesota Mother-Child Project by Eastland, Carlson, and Sroof. They found that over half the maltreated infants showed secure attachment at 12 months.
Which is generally a good sign, right?
Yeah, it can be an early indicator of resilience. But get this. None of those kids remained resilient across all the measures, all the way through first grade. And any improvements they saw were often temporary or only in one specific area.
So a kid might have good emotional control at one age, but struggle with behavior problems later on.
Right. Then there's the summer day camp study by Cicchetti and Rogosh. They followed kids for 3 years and found that a huge chunk, over 40%, of the maltreated kids consistently showed low resilience the whole time. And only a tiny fraction, like 1.5%, were consistently highly resilient over those 3 years.
That's a pretty stark contrast.
It is. And Bolger and Patterson's Charlottesville longitudinal study found something similar. Using really strict criteria for resilience, they found that very few maltreated kids were resilient across all the periods they looked at, from childhood to adolescence.
Less than 1%, according to one of their analyses. That's pretty sobering.
Yeah. And even when you narrow it down to one area, like antisocial behavior, the numbers are still low. Jaffe and his colleagues did a twin study in the UK and found that only about 3% of maltreated kids were resilient at both ages 5 and 7, based on their scores for that. But here's the silver lining. If they were resilient at 5, they were more likely to be resilient at 7.
So early resilience can lay a good foundation, even if it's not a guarantee?
Exactly. Herringcole and his team looked at the transition from school age to adolescence in their Lehigh longitudinal study. They found that only about 61% of the kids who were resilient in elementary school stayed resilient as teenagers. They defined resilience in adolescence by high school graduation, by the way.
So a pretty big drop-off as they hit the teen years.
Yep. And Jaffe and Gallup found the same kind of variability in their NSC-OUS study. Only a tiny percentage, around 2%, were consistently resilient across social, emotional, and academic areas throughout the whole study.
So resilience ebbs and flows. It's not static.
Right. And that seems to continue into adulthood, too. Dumont, Wyndham, and Zaja did a follow-up study of adults who'd been maltreated as kids. Less than 25% of them showed continuous resilience from adolescence to adulthood. And almost half, 46%, weren't resilient in either period.
So even if you're resilient as a teen, it doesn't mean you'll automatically be resilient as an adult.
That's what the data suggests. McGloin and Wyndham found that about 22% of maltreated individuals were resilient in adulthood. And Mirsky and Topitzes found much lower resilience rates for those who'd experienced maltreatment compared to those who hadn't.
Sounds like early adversity can cast a long shadow.
It definitely can. But there is some good news. Some studies looking at specific types of adversity, like childhood sexual abuse, have found higher rates of resilience in adulthood. Banyard and colleagues, for instance, found that around 29% of women with a history of childhood sexual abuse were highly resilient as adults, and another 18% showed what they called excellent resilience.
So even after something as traumatic as that, resilience is possible.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that. But there's one big caveat with all these studies. There's no real consistency in how they define and measure resilience. Different methods, different scales, different cutoffs for what counts as resilient.
So it's hard to compare apples to apples.
Exactly. So while these longitudinal studies give us amazing insights, we need more standardized ways to measure resilience in future research.
Makes sense. Okay, so we're getting a clearer picture of what resilience is and how it works, especially after tough experiences. But the big question is, what can we actually do with this information? How can we help kids, especially those who've had a rough start, become more resilient?
That's where early intervention and resilience building strategies come in. The idea behind early intervention is to get ahead of the game, to address potential issues before they become big problems. It's about being proactive.
And it seems like child mental health agencies are starting to catch on to that.
They are. A lot of them are using evidence-based programs, meaning programs backed by research, like the Incredible Years program, or IY. They work with parents, teachers, and kids with a big focus on social-emotional learning.
What's that exactly?
It's about helping kids learn to understand and manage their emotions, get along with others, and make good choices.
So equipping them with life skills that'll help them no matter what challenges they face.
Right. And IY programs have a few key ingredients that make them really effective. They're developmentally appropriate, involve parents, culturally sensitive, adaptable, evidence-based, and engaging.
Sounds like a good recipe. And I know the research shows that these programs work. They improve behavior, strengthen parenting skills, boost social skills, and even reduce aggression.
Exactly. There are benefits for everyone. Kids, families, agencies, and even society as a whole. It's like a ripple effect.
Our source mentioned that IY programs often use play to teach these social and emotional skills, which makes sense for younger kids. And they have this wraparound approach involving the whole family and teachers.
Yeah, that's key. They create a consistent and supportive environment for the child. Parents learn effective parenting strategies, teachers learn how to build nurturing classrooms, and kids get direct instruction in those crucial social-emotional skills, all in a fun and engaging way.
It's a really holistic model. Now, beyond those formal programs, we also have some great tips from that Psychology Today article on building resilience in kids. Everyday things that parents and educators can do.
Oh yeah, that article is full of practical advice. One big idea is to create an environment, at home or in school, where it's okay to make mistakes, where curiosity and asking questions are encouraged.
Because if kids are afraid to mess up, they'll never try anything new.
Right. And the article also talks about teaching kids that success comes from effort, not just talent. That growth mindset idea from Carol Dweck's work.
The belief that you can get better at something if you work at it.
Exactly. And it's important to help kids see setbacks as temporary bumps in the road, not dead ends. Give them tools and encourage them to use them to solve problems, like visual aids or word walls.
Turn them into problem solvers, not problem avoiders.
Right. Setting small, achievable goals helps them see the connection between effort and results. And when it comes to learning, praising their effort, not just the outcome, is key. Like, encourage invented spelling when they're first learning to write.
That's a great example. It lets them focus on expressing themselves without stressing about perfect spelling.
Exactly. Teach them specific strategies for different challenges, like reading comprehension strategies or how to break down a big problem into smaller steps, and emphasize the process of learning, not just the end product.
And how we praise them matters too.
Right.
The article talked about praising effort and strategies, not just saying, good job.
Yes. Instead of saying, you're so smart, say something like, I love how you use such vivid descriptions in your story, or you did a great job using that reading strategy to figure out that word.
Give them specific feedback that reinforces those good habits.
Exactly. And having clear rules, consistent expectations, and logical consequences helps kids feel safe and understand cause and effect.
Predictability helps them make better choices.
And giving them responsibilities, real jobs to do, makes them feel valued and like they belong.
All these things contribute to their overall sense of self-worth and resilience. So we've covered a lot about kids, but what about the adults in their lives? Our sources really emphasized parental resilience, too.
Oh, it's huge. Turns out how parents handle stress matters more than the stress itself, for both the parent and the child.
So it's not just about what life throws at you, but how you deal with it.
Exactly. Parental resilience is about managing stress and functioning well even when things are tough. And it's linked to more confident parenting, which has positive ripple effects on the child and the parent-child relationship.
It makes sense. If a parent is stressed out all the time, it's harder for them to be the parent their child needs.
That's where the idea of toxic stress comes in. Prolonged exposure to adversity without a supportive adult can really hurt a parent's ability to cope and parent effectively. But the good news is, parents can learn to manage their stress, heal from past trauma, and provide better care for their kids.
So supporting parents ultimately supports kids.
Totally. And the CSSP has outlined 5 protective factors that are crucial for strengthening families and boosting parental resilience.
Let's hear them. What's number 1?
Well, parental resilience itself, having healthy coping mechanisms and self-care strategies. The CSSP has some great questions for parents to reflect on, like, where do you draw strength from? And what do you do to take care of yourself when you're stressed?
It all starts with the parent taking care of themselves. What's next?
Social connections, having a support system, family, friends, neighbors, community groups, it makes a huge difference. The CSSP talks about the risks of isolation and encourages parents to actively build their support networks.
Because it really does take a village. What's number 3?
Knowledge parenting and child development, understanding what's normal at different ages and having effective parenting strategies. The CSSP recommends things like parenting classes and emphasizes having realistic expectations for kids.
Information is power. What's the 4th factor?
Concrete support in times of need, having access to things like food, housing, medical care, mental health services, financial assistance. The CSSP stresses the importance of helping parents find and use these resources.
Because if your basic needs aren't met, it's hard to focus on anything else. And lastly,
Social-emotional competence of children, helping kids develop skills like self-esteem, emotional regulation, and problem-solving. The CSSP highlights the parent's role in nurturing these skills through positive interactions and opportunities for growth.
It's amazing how interconnected it all is. Supporting parents supports families, which supports kids, who then grow up to be resilient adults. It's a beautiful cycle.
It really is. And by understanding these protective factors, we can better support families, especially those who've been through tough times.
This has been a really deep dive into resilience. Before we wrap up, let's recap the key takeaways.
Sure, we learned that resilience is a process, not a trait, and it's influenced by individual factors, environment, and developmental stage. Early intervention and supportive environments are key, especially after adversity. And parental resilience, backed by those 5 protective factors, is absolutely essential for healthy child development.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Knowing that resilience changes over time and is affected by so many things, what's one small shift you can make or one action you can take today to foster more resilience in yourself or a young person you care about? Maybe revisit some of the strategies we discussed or dig deeper into the resources we mentioned.
Building resilience is a journey, and every step, no matter how small, counts.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.